think I'm ready. Are you ready to be challenged today? You need to judge what I say. It talks in John, doesn't it, about test the spirits. I might say something today that you find quite controversial. When I was an IT advisory teacher, I used to go into schools, and I went into one in Plymouth. And on the wall, there was a poster which has always stuck in my mind. And it was a poster which had a big picture of a parachute. And I guess it was probably underneath. It said, "The mind is like a parachute. It's not a lot of use unless it's open." Over the last couple of times that I've spoken, I've been talking about Christianity and its Hebrew roots. Today, I'm going to move more onto the Greek side of things. Of course, the New Testament was written in Greek, and the Old Testament, most of it in Hebrew. But I'm going to also mention some Hebrew aspects towards the end. When I was growing up, there was only really one Bible translation that we used, and that was the King James Version. And of course, learning verses was easy because you only had one version to learn from. But since about the 1950s, there's been a plethora of new translations. Now, I'm sure many of you have watched Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? And I'm sure many of you have seen how they decide who is going to sit in the chair to get the questions. They give them 4 things they've got to put in order. And they're labelled A, B, C and D. And it might be they've got to choose B, A, C, D or whatever it is. But they have to get them in order. And the person who does it quickest is the person who goes to sit in the millionaire's chair. So we're going to do a version of that now. I'm going to show you 4 versions of the Bible, A, B, C and D. And in your own minds, you can then decide which was the order in which they were published. And then I will give you the answer. So if you're ready, because it isn't going to stay here for long, the New King James Version is A, Living Bible is B, New International Version is C, Revised Standard Version is D. Right, you've had enough time. You've had your 5.73 seconds. Okay, so the first one was the RSV. There's an RSV. It went with me all the way through my university studies. And the RSV came out in 1952. So on your list, it's D is first. The next one was the Living Bible. That came out in 1971. The next one is either the NIV or the New King James Version. NIV came out in 1978 and the King James Version in 82. So on here, it was D, B, C, A as the correct order. Did anyone get it? Well done, Mark. Well done. It's not easy. Because, of course, New King James Version and NIV are so close together. Of course, I could have thrown in, just for the fun of it, the Message, 1993 to 2002, the English Standard Version, 2001, the Passion Bible, 2011. I could have said King James Version, but that's 1611. I guess everyone will have known that one, so that would have been too easy. But the interesting thing is that some of these Bible translations are translations, and some of them are actually not Bible translations. They're actually paraphrases or interpretations, and I would label the message and the passion in those categories. Now, whichever translation you use, the English doesn't always carry the full meaning of the original language. For example, the word love, well, in Greek there are three types of love. So which one is being referred to in the Bible? But in the English Bible, it's only translated love. Or you might get something like brotherly love, I guess. But also a direct translation of the original may not carry the original intended meaning, which is why we have versions which are interpretations to help us get there. I have this mighty tome. It weighs a ton, but it's got the New King James Version, the English Standard Version, the New Living Translation, and the Message. And it's very interesting if you have a look at the very start of the Bible, Genesis 1:1. I think I might need my glasses. There they are. So here we go. 4 translations. King James Version. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. English Standard Version. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Very similar, if not identical. The New Living Translation. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless and empty, and darkness covered the deep waters, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. And then we have the Message. First, this. God created the heavens and earth. All you see, all you don't see. Earth was a soup of nothingness, a bottomless emptiness, an inky blackness. God's Spirit brooded like a bird above the watery abyss. Now, as a translation of the Hebrew, yeah, and the original, of course, doesn't ever talk about birds or anything, not in that verse anyway. So that illustrates how different versions vary. And of course, it emphasizes that going back to the original languages of the Greek and the Hebrew is important. The next section of my sharing this morning is going to be about rocks and stones, but of course, Wendy didn't know that I was going to be talking about what rocks and stones when she prepared what she shared earlier. I'm going to read from Matthew chapter 16. Starting at verse 13 and through to 20. When Jesus came into the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, saying, "Who do men say that I, the Son of Man, am?" So they said, "Some say John the Baptist, some Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." And he said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered and said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Jesus answered and said to him, Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I also say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. And I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Then he commanded his disciples that they should tell no one that he was Jesus the Christ. Interesting there that Simon Peter is called Simon Bar-Jonah, which means Simon, son of Jonah. So Jonah must have been his dad, presumably. And yet some of you might say, yeah, but I thought it was Ben, which was the word for son. And actually you'd be right, because Ben is the Hebrew word for son, whereas Bar is the Aramaic word for son. So that's why you get those two differences. And then we've got this wonderful play on words between Petros and Petra, because it says here, Jesus says, I say that you are Peter. In the Greek, that is Petros. And on this rock, that word rock there is Petra. So there's a difference between the word between Petros and Petra. Petros is indeed a rock or stone. In fact, correctly, Petros, I've got, you wouldn't believe this, but this is a Greek-English lexicon. And it just goes on with loads and loads of Greek words and their English translation. It doesn't give us the English back to the Greek. But in here, it actually says that Petros is a piece of rock or a stone. And it says that Petra is a rock or crag. Now, I've been reading from Kathy Gifford's book recently, and she says that in this book, they say Petros describes a shifting, moving rock, whereas Petra is defined as a solid rock. Well, if we go now to another section of Matthew chapter 7, you'll all know that in there we have the parable about the house built on rock and the house built on sand. And it starts in verse 24. Therefore, whoever hears these sayings of mine and does them, I will liken him to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain descended, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, and it did not fall, for it was founded on the rock. Now, the word for rock there is Petra. In other words, it's a solid rock. And it's interesting that in the Greek, because I've got the translation here, I'm reading from the Greek and the English together. And under Petran, which is the word for rock, it actually translates it as bedrock. So therefore, the Petra is the bedrock, if you like, whereas Peter is just a stone. So I don't believe that Jesus is actually saying that he's basing his church on Peter, the individual. I think what Jesus is saying here is that the Petra, the bedrock on which he's basing his church, is Peter's statement about who Jesus is. Peter has just said, you're the Messiah, you're the Son of the living God. And that is what Jesus is saying here. We'll come to 1 Corinthians 3:10 a bit later on, but that's another story. Now, incidentally, in Greek, the word for a stone is lithos. So in Acts 4:11, when Peter says, this is the stone which was rejected by you builders, which has become the chief cornerstone, that is the word lithos. And it's the same in John 8:7, where Jesus says, he who is without sin among you, let him throw a stone at her first. Let him throw the first stone. And it's the same word in 1 Peter 2, verses 4 and 5. Coming to him as a living stone, that's lithos, rejected by men, but chosen by God and precious, you also as living stones are being built up a spiritual house. And that word there is lithoi. It comes from lithos, that's the plural of it, lithoi. And so what we've got here is one word which is used for stone. You've got one word which is a sort of a stone or a rock, but something which you could probably pick up with your hand. That's the petros. And you've got one word, petra, which is the bedrock, if you like. Now, if we go back to Matthew 16, it talks about, excuse me, can I have my water, please? If we go back to Matthew chapter 16, in that same section, it says, I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. What are the gates of Hades? I found this little extract on the internet saying there have been many different interpretations, but the people who had been to this area said it pointed us back to a grotto that it had been associated with the worship of Pan. A stream used to come out of the grotto, but an earthquake has stopped it up. It was believed in ancient times that this grotto contained access to the underworld. When Sue and I were in Greece, we were on the island of Thassos, and we went up by Thassos, up a mountainside. And we were halfway up, and there was what had been once a grotto or a temple or something to Pan. If we come back to this book, Kathy Gifford, she talks, or people in this book talk about this question of the gates of Hades. And what is written in this book is interesting. It says, when Jesus posed this question to his disciples, they were likely standing in front of a large pagan temple in Caesarea Philippi called the Gates of Hades. Now, I've no proof that that is true, but it's an interesting comment. This temple was believed by the Greeks at the time to be the entrance to hell and to the precipitous cavern beneath it, so deep it couldn't be measured. So that covers that. It goes on to say that Jesus goes on to say that he's giving Peter the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Now, I don't know whether you've ever seen any statues of Peter, but he's often pictured, isn't he, with a bunch of keys in his hand. And then it goes on to say something really interesting. Find the right page. It says, I give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. That's a really interesting comment, isn't it? Because actually what it seems to imply, as it's translated there, is that whatever we loose on earth is going to have heavenly implications. And whatever we bind on earth is going to have heavenly implications. And I believe that that is a mistranslation. And people have talked about that for years in terms of binding and loosing. J.B. Phillips wrote he translated the whole of the New Testament into modern English. And it is a really good translation. And when we come to these verses, he translates them like this. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you forbid on earth will be what is forbidden in heaven. And whatever you permit on earth will be what is permitted in heaven. And there's a little star next to it, which takes you to a note at the back of his translation. And I won't read all of it to you because it's very complicated and even I don't understand it, but you'll get the general gist of it. He says, this is a very curious Greek construction here. It's a simple future followed by the perfect participle passive. If Jesus had meant to say, quite simply, whatever you forbid on earth will be forbidden in heaven, can anyone explain why the simple future passive is not used? It seems to me that if the words of Jesus are accurately reported here, and I have no reason to doubt it, then the force of these sayings is that Jesus' true disciples will be so led by the Spirit that they will be following the heavenly pattern. In other words, what they forbid or permit on earth will be consonant or in agreement with the divine rules. If a future passive or a simple future passive had been used, it would mean an automatic heavenly endorsement of the church's actions, which to me at least is a very different thing. And he ends by saying, there's no ground for supposing that celestial endorsement automatically follows human action, however exalted. I often, in my own mind, I think of those verses as whatever you bind on earth will have been bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will have been loosed in heaven. So it's from the heavenly structure through to the earthly structure and not the other way round. Okay, let's move on. So what job did Jesus do when he was alive? Sorry? Carpenter. Everyone agree he was a carpenter? It says in Matthew 13:55, is not this the carpenter's son? And Mark 6:3 says, is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary? So you say he must have been a carpenter. Was he? It depends on the translation, doesn't it? And that's the way it's been translated into English. But is the English right? The Greek word here translated as carpenter is tektone. What does tektone mean? Back to my lexicon here. If we look that up, it says, a worker in wood, a carpenter, joiner, builder. Then it has another set of comments. Any craftsman or workman, a master of any craft. And then it has a double one, a planner, contriver, plotter, generally an author. I'm going to read what Kathy Gifford has written. Ray explained, the word translated carpenter in Matthew 13:55 and Mark 6:3 for how Joseph and Jesus made a living is the Greek word tekton. It means builder. You see, when the writers of the King James Version were translating the Greek into the English, they assumed, oh, these guys were carpenters just like us. The problem with that is that there were no trees that could be used for building in Israel at that time like there were in England. All the wood in Israel came from the cedars of Lebanon, which were cut down, made into rafts, and floated along the Via Maris, the road of the sea, adjacent to the Mediterranean. There they were broken apart and taken to the various construction sites. Ray paused for his point. You see, there were only rocks in Israel. This is an example of one of the many poor translations in the Bible. And then Ray gave us, as it says, a stunning insight. Jesus was not a carpenter. Jesus was a stonemason. Well, you have to make your decision on whether you think she's right or not. But the claim was made there weren't any trees in Israel. Is that right? So I looked up on the internet. And lo and behold, I found this. The plant life of that period, that is in Jesus' time, had the form of suppressed shrubland, low trees and bushes. Only in a few locations, mainly near holy places, were characteristic woodlands and trees preserved. So that seems to support the fact that there weren't a lot of trees in Israel when Jesus was around. And then there's another piece of information I got. How Israel got from hardly a tree or shrub anywhere to being one of the only countries in the world that ended the 20th century with more trees than it had in 1900 is primarily due to the efforts of the Jewish National Fund, which since its founding in 1901 has planted over 250 million trees throughout Israel. In the 19th century and up to World War I, the Ottoman Empire cleared the land of Israel of its natural reserves of pine and oak trees in order to build railways across the empire. That's the Ottoman Empire. Since it was founded, it's planted, and then it says it's planted 260 million trees, creating 280 forests. So what I read from that book about the trees may be correct, that there weren't trees. Or not many of them. So is there anything else to support the idea that Jesus was a builder rather than a carpenter? Now, a builder would know the importance of building on solid ground. Hence Jesus' comment, "On this rock I will build my church." Then there's the parable of the house built on rock and the house built on sand. Let's just have a look at that. I read it earlier, didn't I? I will liken him to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain descended, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, for it did not fall, for it was founded on the rock. And then he says a house built on sand is going to fall. So maybe Jesus knew more about the building scenario than we give him credit for. And then I thought, well, I wonder what else is in the New Testament which could imply that Jesus was a builder rather than a carpenter. Luke 14:28 says, "For which of you, intending to build a tower, does not sit down first and count the cost, whether he has enough to finish it, lest after he has laid the foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it begin to mock him, saying, 'This man began to build and was not able to finish.'" So there's another reference to building. In Matthew 24, verses 1 and 2, Jesus is talking about the buildings on the temple and says that they'll all be destroyed, doesn't he? And of course, in Israel, in Jerusalem today, you can go to the Wailing Wall, but the Wailing Wall is only the foundations of the original temple that was there. And then we have Mark 14:58, where people at Jesus' trial, it's reported, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another made without hands. So maybe Jesus was a builder rather than a carpenter. The interesting one for me, because I didn't know this, is when we come to 1 Corinthians 3 verse 10. 1 Corinthians 3 verse 10 says, according to the grace of God which was given to me as a wise master builder, I have laid the foundation and another builds on it. But let each one take heed how he builds on it. So we've got Paul making reference there to being a wise master builder. The word that is used there is really interesting because it's a combination of two words. The last part of the word is tekton, which of course is, we've said is probably, could be not a carpenter, but a builder. But what's interesting is that master builder has got a bit in front of it. It's got a prefix. It's got the prefix archi. So the full word there is architectone, from which, of course, we get the word architect. Isn't that wonderful? I didn't know that. It's so interesting. So that also points me to the idea that because we've got architectone, then maybe tectone is actually builder rather than carpenter. And I leave you to decide. But it all comes down to, not to a particular translation, but it comes down to, well, what did the original Greek or what did the original Hebrew say? And so it's easy to be deceived if a word gets translated incorrectly, doesn't it? It's interesting that there are many parables built around agriculture, but I can't recall any about carpentry. I'm going to finish now by reading from this book again. It's Kathy Gifford, The Rock, the Road and the Rabbi, for the benefit of those who are watching on a recording of this. And this is from Rabbi Jason, who appears in the book. And he says, Jesus is the tectone, the architect of all creation. This reading aligns perfectly with the Apostle John's understanding of creation. In John 1 verse 3, he states, through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. Jesus is the promised master craftsman and architect of creation who brings order out of chaos and shalom to our lives in this world and in the world to come. You don't have to wait to begin to experience his peace until his kingdom comes. You can have it right now as he promised. Shalom I leave you, my shalom I give to you. but not as the world gives. Do not let your heart be troubled or afraid. That's John 14:27. Shalom's an interesting word, isn't it? And earlier in the book, I'll read it as it says, Ray explained that the word shalom has been diluted through the centuries from its original meaning to now mean peace. But according to Ray, shalom really means God's perfection. Shalom encompasses all the characteristics of God. His righteousness, his justice, his unfailing love, his forgiveness, his holiness, and yes, his peace as well. Shalom is everything that is inherent in the one God and everything he planned for those he created. The Garden of Eden was perfect, and all of creation, including human beings, was perfect, because God was and is and shall forever be perfect. Going back to where I was originally, what sets humankind apart from all other creatures? Only we are made in the image of God. In the Hebrew, it's, my reading of Hebrew is difficult these days, but Tselem Elohim. The word for image in Hebrew is, I'll spell it out to you, T-Z-E-L-E-M. It is derived from the Hebrew word T-Z-E-L, which means shadow. A shadow does not act independently, but is a reflected image. Thus, to be made in God's image means to reflect the image of our Creator. How is this to be accomplished? In Jewish thought, it means that we are to imitate God in all his ways, or as Paul wrote in the New Testament, be imitators of me, just as I also am of Messiah. Bringing light out of darkness and order out of chaos was one of God's first actions as Creator. We are called to do the same, to bring order and shalom to the chaos of the world around us. When we imitate our Creator, we allow God's light to shine in the midst of the darkness, thereby displaying our good works to others so they might glorify our Father in heaven. Matthew 5:16. Living as image bearers brings order and shalom to a broken world, infuses our lives with meaning, and reflects God's image to those around us. God longs to show the world his goodness through the way we live, but unfortunately his goodness and peace can't flourish in the midst of chaos. The Lord always brings order before he fully manifests his blessing of peace. For this reason, when we care for his creation by working with him to bring order out of chaos, we show his goodness to the world. As Jesus taught, let your light shine before men so that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. And so, finally, I ask you the question, do you know God's shalom, God's peace in your life? If you do, which I think is true for most of you here, that's great. But if there are any who don't, then you need to come and talk with either myself or Paul or John or maybe someone else you know. So let's pray. Father, I thank you for what I've been able to share today. I thank you that all those years ago, 60 odd years ago, I was learning Greek and Hebrew, and although I've forgotten the Hebrew, I still retain a bit of the Greek, and I just thank you that it's helpful sometimes. And so I thank you for today. Thank you for your word. Thank you for your word, which is the truth. And we just praise you for your word and all it speaks to us about. In Jesus' name, amen. packing up, that's the difficult bit.